If you have visited or even walked by some of our nation's top museums, you may have noticed that the architects who designed them really seem to have had a thing for columns. But why? Why does almost every natural history museum in the United States look like a shrine to the Greek goddess Athena? Welcome to Notes from the Wunderkammer. I'm Laura Black, and today we're going to try to answer the question that has plagued museum goers for over a century. What's with all the columns? First, it's not all museums. Primarily, we see this architectural trend in encyclopedic and natural history museums, as well as art museums dedicated to pre-modern periods. Secondly, it's not just museums. Many of our most powerful and symbolic buildings incorporated the classical orders, namely the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns. In addition to museums, U.S. historical monuments, courthouses, universities, and even the New York Stock Exchange building were designed using these dramatic pillars. And the United States is not alone. This revival of classical aesthetics, commonly known as neoclassicism, began in France as a response to the maximalist Rococo style and continued to flourish throughout Europe in the 18th and early 19th century. The popularity of neoclassicism was, in no small part, due to the reignited interest in Greek and Latin philosophy brought about by the Enlightenment. In the United States, however, the architectural style took on a more symbolic role, as our young nation's founders sought a connection to what they deemed to be history's great empires. In fact, neoclassical architecture was so popular during the early Republic that it is alternatively known as Federal-style architecture. And our nation's attachment to Greco-Roman aesthetics hasn't gone away. Americans continued to build in the neoclassical style long after it had fallen out of fashion in Europe. Following the Reconstruction era, at a time when the country was reestablishing its collective identity, we saw many notable museums built in the neoclassical style. More recently, in February of 2020, there was even an order drafted by the Trump administration to mandate that all future federal buildings be built in the neoclassical style of architecture. But the question remains, why do we continue to appropriate from a culture that existed almost 3,000 years ago and almost 5,000 miles away? While there is no definitive answer, I suspect that our extended investment in neoclassicism is rooted more in a desire to maintain a power dynamic than it is simply a tribute to Greek aesthetics. The classical orders were developed by the ancient Greeks between their archaic and late classical periods, a historical moment associated with the birth of democracy and philosophy. The columns, painstakingly crafted from local marble, were used primarily in the construction of temples dedicated to Greek gods. These were spaces of reverence that required a significant investment of time, money, and labor to build, and perhaps more significantly, they were the embodiment of Greek identity and power. Later, the Romans would inherit and modify the orders to better fit their larger concrete-based temples, but the experience of approaching one of these monuments would have likely been the same: overwhelming, humbling, and impressive. The U.S. institutions that implemented the neoclassical style knew that when one of us stood under a row of Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian columns, we would feel small too. These buildings are meant to be visually impressive, so much so that sometimes we don't even question the power of the institutions they were constructed for. Build a public museum, we are not only creating a space to exhibit and care for our most precious objects, we are building monuments to our nation. The stories told in these institutions shape our understanding of history and of ourselves. So while that T-Rex skeleton may look awesome, framed by fluted columns, I think it's imperative as museum goers that we think critically about the visual cues that have been designed for us. Neoclassical architecture, beautiful though it may be, isn't simply associated with democracy and philosophy. It is symbolic of empirical power, and it is intrinsically linked to a false narrative of European supremacy. So perhaps the question we should be asking is, are these the values we want to continue to commemorate in our public institutions?